By the end of August, there was still no explanation for the hold, despite efforts by numerous people to seek the release of the funding. The leverage hadn't succeeded in getting the president to, in coercing Ukraine to announce the investigations, and so the aid was withheld. Two witnesses privy to this scheme testified that the only logical conclusion to reach about the president's continued hold on the aid was that it was intended to put more pressure on Ukraine to announce the investigations. As I said, they testified it was as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. We can do math, and more importantly, so can the Ukrainians, and maybe even more importantly than that, so can the Russians. Multiple senior officials, including President Trump himself, have confirmed this logical conclusion. On September 7th, Ambassador Sondland spoke directly to President Trump, who by that point was aware that a whistleblower complaint was circulating that alleged the contours of his scheme, and that Congress and the public were beginning to ask probing questions about the hold on aid, including whether the withholding of the aid was in exchange for re-election help. During that call, September 7th, so July, you've got Bob Mueller's testimony, you've got the call itself, you've got the follow-up call the next day where the president is speaking to Sondland and wants to make sure they're going to do the investigations. You've got August, while they're trying to hammer out a statement, and the Ukrainians are still resisting, and then you have September. September 7th, Ambassador Sondland on the phone with President Trump. At that point, he is aware that a whistleblower has filed a complaint alleging the contours of this scheme, and Congress and the public are beginning to ask questions about the hold on aid, including whether this was to get help in his re-election. And during this call between the president and Ambassador Sondland, without a prompt, President Trump told Sondland, there's no quid pro quo. Now, why would he do that? That's not something that comes up in normal conversation, right? Hello, Mr. President, how are you today? No quid pro quo. That's the kind of thing that comes up in a conversation if you're trying to put your alibi out there. If you've heard about a whistleblower complaint, if you've seen allegations, if you know Congress is starting to sniff around, no quid pro quo. But, and I know this is astonishing, so much of the last 3 years has been a combination of shock and yet no surprise. And yet, even while the president is saying no quid pro quo, what does he say? Zelensky must publicly announce the 2 political investigations, and he should want to do it. No quid pro quo, except this quid pro quo. Sondland immediately relayed the message to President Zelensky, informing him that without the announcement of the political investigations, they would be at a stalemate. Sondland made clear that this reference to a stalemate meant the release of the security assistance. President Zelensky, after hesitating for weeks to join the president's corrupt scheme, finally relented. President Zelensky informed Sondland that he agreed to do a CNN interview. And Sondland understood that he would use that occasion to mention these items, meaning the 2 investigations at the heart of the scheme. The candidate Zelensky, who was swept into office with a landslide victory on a promise of fighting corruption, would be forced to undertake just the same kind of corrupt act he'd been elected to clean up. Upon learning this, Ambassador Taylor called Sondland to register his deep concern, telling him that it was crazy. Taylor later texted Sondland to reinforce the point. As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. As I said on the phone. Clearly, they had discussed it. As I said on the phone. Taylor testified about the message and the events leading up to it. Taylor said that security system was so important for Ukraine, as well as our own national interest. To withhold that assistance for no good reason other than help with the political campaign made no sense. It was counterproductive to all of what we had been trying to do. It was illogical. It could not be explained. It was crazy. What's more, Ambassador Taylor also came to learn that President Trump wanted Zelensky in a public box. He testified Mr. Goldman asking the question, now you referenced a television interview and a desire for President Trump to put Zelensky in a public box, which you also have in quotes. Was that in your notes? Now, this is a reference, I think, to his written testimony. Was that referenced to in a public box in his notes? Remember, he kept detailed notes. Taylor's answer, it was in my notes. And what did you understand to mean to put Zelensky in a public box? And Taylor responds, I understood that to mean that President Trump, through Ambassador Sondland, was asking for President Zelensky to publicly commit to these investigations, that it was not sufficient to do this in private, that this needed to be done, this needed to be a very public statement. So we saw earlier the side-by-side comparison, right, of what the Ukrainians wanted to say. They wanted to make no mention of these specific investigations, and how Giuliani insisted, no, 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 this isn't going to be credible unless you mention these specific investigations. This is what it's going to take. And now you see Ambassador Sondland has acknowledged to Ambassador Taylor that not enough to use even the right language, apparently. Got to be done in public. We're not going to take any private commitment. It's got to be done in public. As we would later come to understand, this is because President Trump didn't care about the investigations being done. He just wanted them announced. He wanted Zelensky in a public box. He wanted it announced publicly. Ambassador Taylor also testified that he understood from Sondland that because President Trump was a businessman, he would expect to get something in return before signing a check.
During our meeting, during our call on September 8th, Ambassador Sondland tried to explain to me that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks that person to pay up before signing the check. Ambassador Volker used the same language several days later while we were together at the Yalta European Strategy Conference. I argued to both that the explanation made no sense. The Ukrainians did not owe President Trump anything.
This is very telling. Ambassador Taylor, Vietnam veteran, West Point graduate. The Ukrainians didn't owe us anything. Clearly, Donald Trump felt the Ukrainians owed him, right? This is not about Ukraine's national security. It's not about our national security. It's not about corruption. No, it's about what's in it for me. Those Ukrainians owe me. Before I sign a check, and by the way, that's not his money. That's your money. That's the American people's money for their defense. But here we see Ambassador Sondland explaining, no, President Trump's a businessman. Before he's going to sign a check, he wants to get something. And of course, that's something that he was going to sign that check for. He's going to make that payment for with our tax dollars. That thing that he was going to buy with those tax dollars was a smear of his opponent and an effort to lift whatever cloud he felt was over his presidency because of the Russian interference on his behalf in the last election. Now, the president has offered an assortment of shifting explanations after the fact for the hold on aid, including that he withheld the money because of corruption in Ukraine or concerns about burden sharing with other European countries. But those arguments are completely without merit. First, the president's own administration had determined by the time of the hold that Ukraine had undertaken all necessary anti-corruption and defense reforms in order to receive the funds. The Defense Department and State Department officials repeatedly made this clear as the hold remained and threatened the ability of the agencies to spend the money before the end of the fiscal year. Second, the evidence revealed that the president only asked about foreign contributions to Ukraine in September, nearly 2 months after the president implemented the hold, and as it became clear that the public, Congress, and a whistleblower were becoming aware of the president's scheme. The after-the-fact effort to come up with a justification also belies the truth. The European countries provide far more financial support to Ukraine than the United States. Their support is largely economic. Ours also includes a lot of military support. But Europe is a substantial financial backer of Ukraine. Something else remarkable about this I was struck by yesterday as we were going through the importance of the witness testimony and looking at some of those redacted emails in which the administration sought to hide its misconduct. In those redactions, when we got to see what was beneath them, and there was an indication, this is very close hold. This is a need-to-know basis only. Remember that? We'll show you that again, but one of those emails that only came to light, I believe, recently, and not because the administration wanted you to see this information, we see there's a desire not to let people know about this hold. If the president was fighting corruption, if he wanted the Europeans to pay more, why would he hide it from us? Why would he hide it from the Ukrainians? Why would he hide it from the rest of the world? If this was a desire to get Europe to pay more, why wouldn't he charge Sondland to go ask Europe for more? Why wouldn't he be proud to tell the Congress of the United States, I'm holding up this aid, and I'm holding it up because I'm worried about corruption? Why wouldn't he? Because, of course, it wasn't true. There's no evidence of that. And what's more, the White House admitted why the president held up the money. The president's own chief of staff explained precisely why during October 17th and October 17th press conference. Let's see again what he had to say.
Those were the driving factors. Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely, no question about that. But that's it, and that's why we held up the money. Now, there was a report.
So the demand for an investigation into the Democrats was part of the reason that he ordered to withhold funding to Ukraine.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation, and that is absolutely appropriate.
But Mulvaney didn't just admit that the president withheld the crucial aid appropriated by Congress to apply pressure on Ukraine to do the president's political dirty work. He also said that we should just get over it. Let's watch.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. If you read the news reports and you believe them, what did McKinney say yesterday? Well, McKinney said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy.
Should the Congress just get over it? Should the American people just come to expect that our presidents will corruptly abuse their office to seek the help of a foreign power to cheat in our elections? Should we just get over it? Is that what we've come to? I hope and pray that the answer is no. We cannot allow a president to withhold military aid from an ally at war for illicit help in a re-election campaign. I hope that we don't have to just get over that. I hope that we just don't have to get accustomed to that. Is that what we want to tell our constituents? Yeah, the president withheld aid from an ally. Yeah, it damaged our national security. And yeah, he wouldn't meet with a foreign leader who's important to us unless he got help in the next election. And yeah, it's wrong to try to get a foreign power to help. It's kind of cheating, really. If we're going to be honest about it and blatant about it, it's cheating. Americans are supposed to decide American elections, but, you know, I guess we just need to get over it. I guess that's just what we should now expect of a president of the United States. I guess there's really no remedy for that anymore. The impeachment, I mean, maybe that was a good idea 200 years ago, but I guess we just need to get over it. I guess maybe the president really is above the law because they say you can't indict the president. The president says you can't even investigate the president. The president is in court saying you can not only not indict the president, you can't even investigate the president. Attorney General's position is you can't even investigate the president. Are we really prepared to say that? The only answer to presidential misconduct is we just need to get over it? What are we going to say with the next president? What are we going to say with the president who's from a different party, who refuses the same kind of subpoenas? And the president says to you, or his chief of staff says to you, or her chief of staff says to you, just get over it. I'm not doing anything different than Donald Trump did. Just get over it. He asked for help in the next election. I'm asking for help in the next election. Just get over it. We do this kind of thing all the time. People are cynical enough as it is about politics, about people's commitment to their good. Cynical enough without having us confirm it for them. I think it's more than crazy. That was Ambassador Taylor's word. I think it's more than crazy. I think it's a gross abuse of power. And I don't think the impeachment power is a relic. If it is a relic, I wonder how much longer our republic can succeed. For months, President Trump and his agents had pressured Ukraine to announce investigations. And President Zelensky finally yielded. As previously noted, he scheduled a CNN interview and planned to publicly announce the politically motivated investigations. He informed Sondland of this plan during a September 7th phone call. In the same call, Sondland relayed to President Zelensky that Trump required that the Ukrainian leader make the public announcement in order to get the critical military aid. President Trump's corruption had finally worn down President Zelensky, overcoming his effort to remain true to his anti-corruption platform, until events intervened. Before Zelensky could do the interview, President Trump learned that his scheme had been exposed. Facing public and congressional pressure on September 11th, the president finally released the hold on aid to Ukraine. Just like with the implementation of the hold, he provided no reason for the release. But the reason is quite simple. The president got caught. In late August, President Trump learned about a whistleblower complaint that was winding its way through the intelligence agencies on its way to Congress. On September 9th, 3 House committees announced an investigation into President Trump's Ukraine misconduct and that of his proxy, Rudy Giuliani. Later that day, again, September 9th, the Intelligence Community Inspector General notified the Senate and House Intelligence Committees of the existence of the complaint and the fact that it was being withheld from Congress contrary to law and in an unprecedented fashion. Facing significant public pressure on September 11th, the president gave up and released the money to Ukraine. 1 week later, President Zelensky canceled the CNN interview. And rather than demonstrate contrition or acknowledge wrongdoing, the president instead has continued his effort, even after the impeachment investigation began. He not only continued to call on Ukraine to investigate his political opponent and called on China to do the same. This should concern all of us. It's a confirmation not only of the scheme to pressure Ukraine to help his political campaign, but a clear sign that the president believes that these corrupt acts are acceptable. A president this unapologetic, this lawless, this unbound to the Constitution and the oath of office must be removed from that office, lest he continue to use the vast presidential powers at his disposal to seek advantage in the next election. President Trump's abuse of powers of his office undermined the integrity of our free and fair elections and compromised America's national security. If we don't stand up to this peril today, we will write the history of our decline with our own hand. If President Trump is not held to account, we send the message to future presidents, future Congresses, and generations of Americans that the personal interests of the president can fairly take precedent over those of the nation. The domestic effects of this descent from democracy will be a weakened trust in the integrity of our elections and the rule of law, and a steady decline of the spread of democratic values throughout the world. For how can any country trust the United States as a model of governance if it is one that sanctions precisely the political corruption and invitation to foreign meddling that we have long sought to help eradicate in burgeoning democracies around the world? To protect against foreign interference in our elections, we have guardrails built into our democratic system. We have campaign finance laws to ensure that political assistance can come only from domestic actors, and we take seriously the need to shore up the integrity of our voting systems so that a foreign government or actor cannot change vote tallies. The promise of one person, one vote is only effective if each vote is cast free of foreign interference. Americans decide American elections. At least they should. Now, what if electoral corruption is even more insidious? What happens when the invitation comes from within? Our framers understood that threat too. George Mason noted at the Constitutional Convention that impeachment was a necessary tool because the man who has practiced corruption and by that means procured his appointment in the first instance could seek to repeat his guilt. In June of last year, President Trump was clear that if a foreign government offered dirt on his political opponent, he would take it. A statement deeply at odds with the guidance provided at the time by his own FBI director, the former Federal Elections Commissioner chair, and our Constitution, written some 233 years ago. In no uncertain terms, it admonishes that any person holding office of profit or trust, it admonishes against them accepting of any present from a foreign state. But President Trump did more than take the foreign help in 2019, as he had done in 2016. This time, he not only asked for it in the July 25th call, but when he didn't get the help from the Ukrainian president in the form of the announced investigations, he withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer-funded military aid and a coveted White House meeting to increase the pressure on Ukraine to comply. And later, he demonstrated no remorse and continued to encourage Ukraine to conduct the political investigations he wanted, even asking other countries to do so. The consequences of these actions alone have shaken our democratic system. What message will we send if we choose not to hold this president accountable for his abuse of power, to solicit re-election interference in our upcoming election? The misconduct undertaken by this president may lead future presidents to believe that they too can use the substantial power conferred on them by the Constitution in order to undermine it. Nothing could weaken the integrity of our elections more, and no campaign finance law or statement by a future FBI director could stand up to the precedent of electoral misconduct set by the President of the United States if we do not say clearly that this behavior is unacceptable and, more than unacceptable, impeachable. We also undermine our global standing as a country long viewed as a model for democratic ideals worth emulating. We have, for generations, been the shining city upon a hill that President Reagan described. America is not just a country, but also an idea. But what worth is that idea if, when tried, we do not affirm the values that underpin it? What will those nascent democracies around the world conclude? That democracy is not only difficult, but maybe that it's too difficult? Maybe that it's impossible? And who will come to fill the void that we leave when the light from that shining city upon a hill is extinguished? The autocrats with whom we compete, who value not freedom and fair elections, but the unending rule of a repressive executive. Autocrats that value not freedom of the press and open debate, but disinformation, propaganda, and state-sanctioned lies. Vladimir Putin would like nothing better. The Russians have little democracy left thanks to Vladimir Putin. It's an autocracy, it's a thugocracy. The Russian storyline, the Russian narrative, the Russian propaganda, the Russian view they would like people around the world to believe is that every country is just the same corrupt system. There's no difference. It's not a competition between autocracy and democracy. No, it's just between autocrats and hypocrites. They make no bones about their loss of democracy. They just want the rest of the world to believe you can't find it anywhere. Why take to the streets in Moscow to demand something better if there's nothing better anywhere else? That's the Russian story. That's the Russian story. That's who prospers by the defeat of democracy. That's who wins by the defeat of our democratic ideals. It's not other democracies. It's the autocrats who are on the rise all over the world. I think all of us in this room have grown up in a generation where each successive generation lived with more freedom than the one that came before. We each had more freedom of speech and association, freedom to practice our faith. This was true at home, it was true all over the world. And I think we came to believe this was some immutable law of nature, only to find it isn't. Only to come to the terrible realization that this year fewer people live in freedom than last, and there's no guarantee that next year people will live in more freedom than today. And the prospect for our children is even more in doubt. Turns out there's nothing immutable about this. Every generation has to fight for it. We're fighting for it right now. There's no guarantee that this democracy that has served us so well will continue to prosper. We will struggle to protect this idea. And even as we do, we will struggle to protect our security in more tangible ways. Support for an independent and democratic Ukraine, which is the literal bulwark against Russian expansionism in Europe, is essential to our security. Russia showed that when it invaded Ukraine in 2014 and sought to redraw the map of Europe. Was our commitment to Ukraine's independence and sovereignty just an empty promise? Or are we prepared to support its efforts to keep Russia contained so that they and we may all eventually enjoy a long peace? Russia is not a threat, I don't need to tell you, to Eastern Europe alone. Ukraine has become the de facto proving ground for just the types of hybrid warfare that the 21st century will become defined by: cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, efforts to undermine the legitimacy of state institutions, whether that is voting systems or financial markets. The Kremlin showed boldly in 2016 that with the malign skills it honed in Ukraine, they would not stay in Ukraine. Instead, Russia employed them here to attack our institutions, and they will do so again. Indeed, they've never stopped. Will we allow the primary country now fighting Russia to be weakened, placing our troops in Europe at greater risk and opening the door to greater interference in our affairs at home? If we allow the President of the United States to pursue his political and personal interests rather than the national interest, we send a message to our European allies that our commitment to a Europe free and whole is for sale to the highest bidder. The strength of our global alliances relies on a shared understanding of what that alliance stands for, one built on the rule of law, on free and fair elections, on a shared struggle against aggression from autocratic regimes. We are countries built on a commitment to our people, not unyielding loyalty to a president who would be king. A president has a right to hold a call with a foreign leader, yes. And he has a right to decide the time and location of a meeting with that leader, yes. And he has a right to withhold funding to that leader should the law be followed and the purpose be just. But he does not, under our laws and under our Constitution, have a right to use the powers of his office to corruptly solicit foreign aid, prohibited foreign aid in his reelection. He does not. He does not have the right to withhold official presidential acts to secure that assistance, and he certainly does not have the right to undermine our elections and place our security at risk for his own personal benefit. No president, Republican or Democrat, can be permitted to do that. Now let me turn to the second article of impeachment, which charges the president with misusing the powers of his office to obstruct and interfere with the impeachment inquiry. The evidence you'll hear during the House presentation is equally undeniable and damning. President Trump issued a blanket order directing the entire executive branch not to cooperate with the impeachment inquiry and to withhold all documents and testimony. His order was categorical, it was indiscriminate, and historically unprecedented. No president before President Trump has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. The president was able to block agencies across the executive branch from producing any records or documents to the House investigative committees, despite duly authorized subpoenas. The White House continues to refuse to produce a single document or record in response to a House subpoena that remains in full force and effect. The Department of State and Office of Management and Budget, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense continue to refuse to provide a single document or record in response to House subpoenas that remain in full force and effect. It is worth underscoring this point. The House has yet to receive a single document from the executive branch agencies pursuant to its subpoenas. Not a single piece of paper, email, or other record has been turned over, not one. While I pause to get a drink of water, let me let you know for your timing, I have about 10 minutes left in my presentation. So the end is in sight. President Trump has also successfully blocked witnesses, 9 of them under subpoena, from testifying. Witnesses with firsthand knowledge of the president's actions, including his closest aides, some of whom were directly involved in executing the president's improper orders. These witnesses include Mick Mulvaney and Robert Blair, Russell Vought, the acting head of the Office of Management and Budget, Michael Duffy, a senior official, and the president's chief legal advisor on the National Security Council, John Eisenberg, among others. The managers will present in detail what these officials knew about their role in executing different parts of the president's scheme. There's no dispute, nor could there be, that President Trump's order substantially obstructed the House impeachment inquiry. That obstruction continues unabated today, even as we stand here at the start of the president's trial. And the president has been able to do so only because of the uniquely powerful position that he holds as our commander-in-chief. No other American could seek to obstruct an investigation into his own wrongdoing this way. No other American could use the vast powers and levers of his government to conduct a corrupt scheme to benefit themselves, and then use those same powers to suppress evidence and bar any cooperation with the authorities investigating them. Not a police chief, not a mayor, not a governor, not any elected official in the country, and certainly not any non-elected official in the country. All those folks watching us from around the country, you know what would happen to them if they defied a lawful subpoena. They got a subpoena commanding them to appear. You know what would happen to them, because they're not above the law. They'd be arrested, they'd be detained, they'd be incarcerated, they would be forced to comply. They're not above the law, and neither are we, and neither is the president. And yet, despite the fact that he is not above the law, the president's extensive and persistent efforts, the House heard from courageous witnesses who did obey lawful subpoenas. And we gathered overwhelming evidence. The House built a formidable case that forms the basis of these articles. The second article for obstruction of Congress is not simply about President Trump's decision to obstruct a congressional investigation or even an impeachment inquiry. It should not be misunderstood as some routine dispute between two branches of government, nor should it be reduced to the notion that the president was simply protecting himself or fighting back against a partisan or overzealous Congress. The charges in the second article are much more serious and urgent than that. First, the president's attempt to obstruct the inquiry so categorically and comprehensively is part and parcel of the president's furious effort to conceal, suppress, and cover up his own misconduct. From the very first moment his actions were at the risk of coming to light, President Trump sought to hide and cover up key evidence, even as his scheme to pressure Ukraine was still underway. As the House presentation will make clear, the president's cover-up started even before the House began to investigate the president's Ukraine-related activity. The president learned early on of the existence of a lawful whistleblower complaint from within the intelligence community that would ring the first alarm. He deployed the White House and Justice Department to intervene in an unprecedented fashion to conceal and then withhold from Congress, for the first time ever, a credible and urgent whistleblower complaint, even though the law requires that it be provided to the congressional intelligence committees. Once the impeachment inquiry was underway in late September, the president used the immense and unique power at his disposal to direct and maintain at every turn the categorical defiance of congressional scrutiny, even as he attacked the inquiry itself and its witnesses. The president offered multiple and shifting justifications for obstructing the House's inquiry, each of them deficient, while his actions and statements powerfully reflect his own consciousness of guilt. Second, the ramifications of the president's obstruction go beyond the sinister motives of simply covering up his actions. His obstruction strikes at the heart of our Constitution. It threatens the last line of defense our founders purposely enshrined in our system to protect our democracy. If presidents can obstruct an impeachment inquiry undertaken by the House, and evade accountability in the Senate. For doing so, they usurp an essential power granted exclusively to the Congress, and for a reason. Presidents could seize for themselves the power to neutralize and nullify the impeachment clause in order to shield themselves from any accountability. And if Congress is unable to investigate and impeach a president for abuse of their office, our democracy's essential check on a rogue president would fail. It would no longer protect the American people from a corrupt president who presents an ongoing threat. This is the outcome every American should be concerned about, and one that the founders warned us about. Through the impeachment clause, the framers of the Constitution empowered Congress to thoroughly investigate presidential malfeasance and to respond, if necessary, by removing the president from office. This entire framework depends upon Congress's ability to discover and then to thoroughly and effectively investigate presidential misconduct. Without the ability of Congress to do that, the impeachment power is a nullity. If you can't investigate it, you can't enforce it, you can't apply it. What we confront here in the second article of impeachment is therefore an impeachable offense aimed at destroying the impeachment power itself. When a president abuses the power of his office to so completely defy House investigators and does so without lawful cause or excuse, he attacks the Constitution itself. He confirms that he sees himself as above the law. His actions destabilize the separation of powers that defines our democracy and preserves our freedom, and establish an exceedingly dangerous precedent. And he proves that he is willing to destroy a vital safeguard against tyranny, a safeguard meant to protect the American people, just to advance his own personal interest in covering up evidence. The House presentation of the second article will therefore focus on three core areas that confirm the president's obstruction and require his removal from office. First, the singular importance and role of the impeachment clause for our democracy and why an effort by a president to obstruct an impeachment inquiry is in and of itself an impeachable offense. Second, why the president's extensive effort to cover up evidence of his misconduct is unprecedented in American history and without lawful cause or justification. And finally, why the president's obstruction poses a direct threat to our system of self-governance, with consequences for all Americans today and in the future, and for both chambers of Congress. Over the coming days, you will hear from the House managers details of this scheme and the effort to hide it from Congress. The articles of impeachment that the House presented go to the heart of those efforts, and let me share a few key takeaways. The House of Representatives has found that using the powers of his eye office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 U.S. presidential election improperly and to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on Ukraine's public announcement of these investigations. And he engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of his personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the U.S. democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. As part of the House's impeachment inquiry, the committees undertaking that investigation served subpoenas, seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices, current and former officials. In response and without lawful cause, or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. As George Washington and his troops retreated across the Delaware River in early December 1776, they were read the words of Thomas Paine, published that month in his pamphlet, The American Crisis. These are the times the try men's souls, the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.